Good evening, and thank you for joining UT Arlington for the first virtual edition of the Maverick Speaker Series for 2021-2022. My name is Dr. Jason Shelton, and I serve as an Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center for African American Studies. Founded in 2008, the Maverick Speaker Series brings thought-provoking and engaging conversations to our students and the UTA community. Our speaker tonight, Emmy-winning filmmaker, literary scholar, journalist, Henry Louis Gates Jr., continues this tradition of excellence. I am pleased that the university was very supportive in inviting Dr. Gates in celebrating the Center for African American Studies' 10th anniversary. I'd like to provide some groundwork for tonight's event. More than 2,000 people have signed up to listen to Dr. Gates' discussion on the historical links between Reconstruction and voter suppression. This is by far more viewers than we have ever had. Thank you very much. He will talk about these issues for 15 to 20 minutes. And after that, Dr. Gates and I will have an informal conversation on a wide range of issues. We'll learn his views from everything from critical race theory to the consequences of the growth of the contemporary African American middle class. But our night will begin with a short video clip from Dr. Gates that he produced as part of a four-part documentary series on PBS called Reconstruction: America After the Civil War. Dr. Gates's remarks will begin immediately following the video, which lasts for about 2 minutes. However, let me begin tonight's event by introducing our speaker. Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. is the Alphonse Fletcher University Professor and Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Again, he is an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, literary scholar, journalist, cultural critic, and institution builder. Professor Gates has authored or co-authored 25 books, 23 documentary films, including Wonders of the African World, African American Lives, Faces of America, Black in Latin America, Black America Since MLK, and Africa's Great Civilizations. Finding Your Roots, his groundbreaking genealogy series, is now in its 7th season at PBS. It has been called one of the deepest and wisest series ever on television. Professor Gates' 6-part documentary series, The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, which he wrote, executive produced, and hosted, earned an Emmy Award for Outstanding Historical Program, as well as a Peabody Award, the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award, and an NAACP Image Award. This is but one of many groundbreaking series that he has developed over the years, including Reconstruction: America After the Civil War, and his newest film series, which is The Black Church: This Is Our Story, This Is Our Song. He is the recipient of over 58 honorary degrees and numerous prizes. Professor Gates was a member of the first class awarded the Genius Grants by the MacArthur Foundation in 1981, and in 1998, he became the first African-American scholar to be awarded the National Humanities Medal. He was named to the 25 Most Influential Americans by Time magazine in 1997, to Ebony magazine's Power 150 list in 2009, and Ebony's Power 100 list in 2010 and 2012. Dr. Gates has directed the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research, now called the Hutchins Center, since he arrived at Harvard in 1991. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He serves on a wide variety of boards, including the New York Public Library, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Jazz at Lincoln Center, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Brookings Institution. With that, ladies and gentlemen, let's watch a clip from one of Dr. Gates' many contributions.
Most of us know that our country fought a civil war in the 1860s, but less is known about what came afterward. the chaotic, exhilarating, and ultimately devastating period known as Reconstruction.
Did you ever study Reconstruction in school?
No.
A paragraph or two. We never really studied it.
I didn't learn anything about Reconstruction.
Reconstruction was our shining moment. It's the second founding of our country.
Overnight, people who have been defined as property take leadership positions in the South. So this is an incredibly heady moment, kind of like Barack Obama becoming president. But those black folks had no idea of the cliff they were heading towards.
Reconstruction produced a violent backlash, a racist backlash.
I want us to tell the truth about our history, not to punish America. I want to liberate us, but we can't get to liberation if we don't acknowledge what we've done.
It's our town now!
Do you believe that we as a nation are still undergoing the process of Reconstruction?
You might almost say it never ended. We are still trying to come to terms with the consequences of the end of slavery in this country.
This is a chapter of our history that's been misrepresented and misunderstood. It's time that we acknowledge the true story and complete the work of reconstructing America.
Thanks so much, Jason, for that kind introduction. Man, I thought I was in church. You know, you have another calling. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person, but, you know, this Delta variant is such a monster. And I appreciate the fact that we could do this virtually. And I'd like to thank everybody for watching this evening. And happy 10th anniversary. There's nothing more important than us in the Academy having strong centers of African and African American studies. And what you and your colleagues are doing at UTA is remarkable. And we admire you so much from a distance up here at Harvard. And anything that we can do, any way that we could collaborate, man, that would be so very exciting. So thank you for your very kind words. Actually, you know, your introduction came a day after my birthday. I feel like I'm having happy birthday sung to me through the power of your oration. So why is Reconstruction relevant? Why should we care? And why should we care about it now? Well, Reconstruction was the period following the Civil War between 1865 and 1877, when Black people experienced more freedom and more rights than at any other time before in American history. It was the time of Abraham Lincoln's new birth of freedom. Historians call it America's second founding. And most schools don't teach much about Reconstruction. I don't know about you, Jason, but when I was a student, we never even talked about Reconstruction at all. And we'll talk about why in a minute. Most curricula skip from Lee's surrender at Appomattox straight to Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and the Civil Rights Movement, leaving a lot of students wondering why, if Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, why do we need a Civil Rights Movement? So after celebrating the triumphs that Black people made under Reconstruction, we asked, how could Black men be given the vote in the year 1867 in the South and in 1870 nationally, but then be systematically deprived of the vote 20 years later through voter suppression by state constitutional conventions throughout the South? How could America fight our costliest war of all wars to end slavery and save the Union at the cost of 750,000 lives? Yet see Jim Crow established as the law of the land by the Supreme Court of the United States and other forms of economic neo-slavery, effectively creating a de facto apartheid state just 31 years after the Civil War. How could that happen? Well, the great W.E.B. Du Bois, as you know, Jason, the first Black person to get a PhD in history from Harvard University, said this about Reconstruction. And I quote, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery." And that, in a nutshell, is what happened to our people in that brief time between 1865 and 1877. Most people don't know that just a few weeks before he was so tragically assassinated, Dr. King reflected on the importance of Reconstruction. It was the 100th birthday celebration for Dr. Du Bois, February 23rd, 1968. And this is what Martin Luther King said about Reconstruction. To understand why Du Bois' study of Reconstruction was a monumental achievement, it's necessary to see it in context. White historians had for a century crudely distorted the Negro's role in the Reconstruction years. It was a conscious and deliberate manipulation of history, and the stakes, Martin Luther King said, were high. And this is why they were high. The Reconstruction was a period in which Black men had a small measure of freedom of action. If, as white historians tell it, Negroes wallowed in corruption, opportunism, displayed spectacular stupidity, were wanton, evil, and ignorant, then their case was made. They would have proven that freedom was dangerous in the hands of inferior beings. One generation after another of Americans, Dr. King says, were assiduously taught these falsehoods, and the collective mind of America became poisoned with racism and stunted with myths. So understanding Reconstruction and its rollback is pivotal to understanding the history of race relations in America today. And even Black people don't know that much about Reconstruction. Reconstruction has been lost to history. So I turned to the great scholar of Reconstruction, Eric Foner, and asked him if he would collaborate with me and produce the 4-hour series that you mentioned, which was honored with the Columbia DuPont Award. And these are the highlights. The brilliant, remarkable things that happened during Reconstruction, the redefinition of citizenship and rights for Black people and all Americans through civil rights laws and constitutional amendments. Which amendments? The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865. Many of you saw Ava DuVernay's marvelous documentary, The 13th. And on December 6, 1865, slavery was abolished with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. The ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868 guaranteed birthright citizenship, due process, and equal protection under the laws. And then in 1870, the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which gave all Black men the right to vote. But even before the 14th and 15th Amendments were ratified, there were key acts of Congress that we have to remember. The Civil Rights Act of '66 passed over Andrew Johnson's veto, established birthright citizenship, and stated that Black people must enjoy the same rights as white people. You ever wonder why America's one of 33 nations with birthright citizenship? Because that was the only way that they could figure out how to give the formerly enslaved people citizenship. Because the Dred Scott decision from the Supreme Court, it said that the founders never had us in mind as citizens. So we needed to establish birthright citizenship, which was established with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is still on the books, and then formally incorporated in the Constitution with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 also granted federal officials the authority to prosecute anyone who violates this new law. And then Congress passed 4 Reconstruction Acts between 1867 and 1868, again, over President Johnson's veto. And they carved the defeated Confederate states into 5 military districts and required them to hold elections for new constitutional conventions, which would not be legitimate unless Black men were given the right to vote. They also had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Now, keep in mind, Jason, this is a surprise to most of us, but even in the so-called free North, Black men could only vote in 5 of the 6 New England states, plus the state of New York, if they could satisfy a $250 property requirement, which is why we needed the 15th Amendment to give even Black men in the so-called free North the right to vote as well. The right to vote led to a tremendous grassroots ferment among Black women and men. Now remember, only men could vote, but Black women were right there organizing, particularly in the churches, telling their husbands, their brothers, their uncles, and their cousins that they had to vote, that they had to register, that they had to vote, and tell them how to vote. So the first Freedom Summer, in my opinion, was the summer of 1867, Black men in the South got the right to register, to vote. And in the election of 1868, 500,000 Black men cast their ballots, the lion's share for Ulysses S. Grant. And in South Carolina, Black men elected a Black majority to its lower house. And this was just 3 years after slavery ended, when 90% of all Black people had been enslaved in the South and were illiterate by law. South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana had majority Black populations. And I want to repeat that. 90% of all Black people until 1910 lived in the South. And South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana had majority Black populations. And Florida, Alabama, and Georgia almost had majority Black populations. So the potential for Black political domination was seen as a very real threat to Black power. How did those Black men vote? Well, between 1870 and 1877, they elected 16 Black men to Congress, including the appointment of 2 United States senators. And by 1901, there had been a total of 20 Black men elected to the House of Representatives and 2 Black senators in Congress. Overall, about 2,000 Black men were elected or appointed at every level of government. And in addition, Black men and women built the Black community under freedom, reuniting families that had been separated by slavery, building churches, of course, particularly Mother Emanuel in Charleston under the direction of Reverend Richard Harvey Kane, and schools. The South's first state-funded public school systems were authorized by those Black integrated state legislatures throughout the former Confederacy, and of course the founding of our HBCUs during this period. Now, these gains did not come without a cost. White supremacy took the form of American terrorism and emerged like a volcano in reaction to the new threat of the Black vote: lynchings, violence, rape, intimidation, and fraud. There were 8 major massacres between 1866 and 1876 in Memphis, New Orleans, Camilla, Meridian, Colfax, Coshada, Vicksburg, and Hamburg. There were 3,724 lynchings between 1889 and 1930. 80% of the victims were Black. Slavery had ended, Jason, but cotton still needed to be planted and harvested. Cotton remained the leading export crop of the United States until the 1930s. So the need for cheap labor for the cotton industry led to sharecropping, peonage, vagrancy acts that allowed so-called idle Black men. You and I and our colleagues could have just been standing around, and we could have been arrested and put on the chain gang. And there was an economic anxiety. The first depression, the first Great Depression, was now called the Panic of 1873. And it made people question if the country could still afford keeping federal troops in the former South to guarantee Black men the right to vote. Then there was the retreat from equality in the courts. The Supreme Court eviscerated the Reconstruction Amendments, notably in a Supreme Court case called the U.S. versus Cruikshank in 1876, which stated that the 14th Amendment is only about state action and not private behavior, and the infamous civil rights cases of 1883, which struck down the very liberal Civil Rights Act of 1875. And starting in 1890 came voter suppression, disenfranchisement, with what's known as the Mississippi Plan of 1890, which Jason became the blueprint for new state constitutions throughout the South, replacing all those liberal Reconstruction era constitutions. And those new state constitutions after 1890 instituted poll tax, literacy tests, and other forms of voter suppression. And Black voter participation eroded. Future Governor James Kimball Vardaman said about Mississippi's Constitutional Convention, "There is no use to equivocate or lie about the matter. Mississippi's Constitutional Convention was held for no other purpose than to eliminate the N-word from politics. Not the ignorant, he emphasized, but the N-word, quote unquote. Now remember, Mississippi, as you know, Jason, was the first state to send a black man to the United States Senate in 1870. That was Hiram Revels. And this Mississippi plan, this new nefarious form of constitutional revision, spread throughout the South. In South Carolina in 1895, Louisiana in 1898, Alabama in 1901, Virginia in 1902, Georgia in 1908. And I'll give you an example of how devastatingly effective this was. In Louisiana, remember one of those majority black states? In 1899, there were over 130,000 registered black voters. By 1904, that number, because of voter suppression, had been reduced precisely to 1,342. From 130,000 in 1898, I made a mistake, 1898, down to 1,342 in 1904. And in the 14 black belt counties in Alabama, African-American registered voters fell from 79,000 in 1900 to 1,081 after the Constitution, the new Constitution was passed in 1901. And in 1896, of course, Plessy v. Ferguson made Jim Crow the law of the land. And then came simultaneously the revision of the memory, both of the purpose of the Civil War and racist interpretations of Reconstruction, which is what Dr. King's speech was all about. It was called the Lost Cause Campaign. And that became our nation's first culture war. The genius, the evil genius, as it were, behind the Lost Cause Campaign was a woman named Mildred Lewis Rutherford. Now, I want you to remember her name. She was the Historian General of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And she wrote a textbook in the 1890s called The Measuring Rod. And the measuring rod was to be used by teachers and librarians to verify if an historical text, a textbook, a history of the Civil War or of Reconstruction was within the proper, her word, guidelines. And I'm quoting from this book, which I made my graduate students at Harvard read last year, and they couldn't believe it. Quote, reject a book that says the South fought the Civil War to hold her slaves. Reject a book that glorifies Abraham Lincoln. Can you believe that? Reject a book that says the slaveholder of the South was cruel and unjust. That was America's first cultural war, ladies and gentlemen. Her common core was a lost cause. And this effort led to the construction of so many of the Confederate monuments that we see sprinkled throughout the South today, and which, thank goodness, are being taken down. These are key aspects of our nation's first social media war. And in response, Black people created new forms of resistance, political, cultural, and organizational. We launched the war of images on a broad scale. We countered images of the New South, we countered images of the New South with images of what we call the trope of the new Negro, in response to a mountain of racist Sambo images spread on an unprecedented scale on postcards and advertisements, on trade cards, on games and commonplace objects. In color, through chromolithography, Black people conceived of the concept of a new Negro to show that Black people weren't inferior, that they were worthy of citizenship. And we distributed those images in print and art in our own Black newspapers and magazine. W.E.B. Du Bois globalized this new Negro movement with an exhibition of the new Negro at the Paris Exposition, which is what the World Fair was called at that time, at the Paris Exhibition in 1900. He and his comrades were fighting to continue Reconstruction by other means. He and fellow New Negroes formed the Niagara Movement in 1905, and then the NAACP in 1909 to fight back against the rollback of Reconstruction and the rise and implementation of Jim Crow. The rollback of Reconstruction lasted far longer than Reconstruction itself, and it continues to this day with voter suppression that we see spreading through Republican-dominated legislatures throughout the South. Today's rollback is part of the reaction to the election of Barack Obama as our first Black president. To be honest, we have to admit that his 8 wonderful years in the White House stirred up massive racial resentment, and we saw with Donald Trump and his campaign and all during his 4 years of presidency, which capitalized on white racial fear. This is why the history of Reconstruction matters today, Jason, because the problems that emerged during Reconstruction have never been resolved. So now it's time to change the narrative, ladies and gentlemen. I made our PBS series and I wrote the accompanying book to show that if we could get through the nightmare of the rollback of Reconstruction through the imposition of Jim Crow, the low point, or the nadir, as you know, as the great Black historian Rayford Logan called it, the nadir in American race relations, then we can get through the new surge of white supremacist rhetoric, birtherism, the attack on affirmative action in the courts, gerrymandering and voter suppression, xenophobia, and anti-immigrant feelings that we are experiencing today. History repeats itself, ladies and gentlemen, but only if we let it. Thank you very much.
It's a whole nother level, my man, to have you here and to hear you say it. Not watching it on YouTube or reading the books, but hearing you say it is just absolutely amazing, sir. It's just such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well,
I was going to mention happy birthday to you, sir. I was going to get there for sure.
Oh, thank you, man. Thank you. Well, I can't think of a better way to spend my birthday than with you.
Hey, all good, sir. Well, I want to ask some follow-ups here. And for ladies and gentlemen watching from home, we're going to be a bit more informal. I'm going to call the good Dr. Skip. And we're going to have some good conversation on and move. We're going to stay with history, but we're going to move also to the modern day, as Skip did at the end of his talk there. But let's go back a little bit in the past, sir. And let's go back to Reconstruction. You're exactly right. It is just not very much so talked about. I will say here in the Center for African American Studies, we do talk about Reconstruction. The history department here at UTA does have classes in it. But those, as you know, are recent phenomenons. These are not things that have been adequately discussed in our society and our institutions over the last 50 years. We're really only getting to that point now. But with that, sir, let's talk about Black folks and Reconstruction. How did we begin to change that narrative, as you talked about yesterday? What is some of that formula from those days of Reconstruction that we can borrow from now in the modern day in terms of moving forward in today's world and Black folks and voter suppression?
Well, the most important thing is that we protect the right of everyone to vote. I mean, what is more un-American than voter suppression? What could possibly be more un-American than trying to restrict access to the polls for anybody? But you know this is being targeted against Black people. Why? Because of the powerful concentration of Black people still throughout the South. Those questions, who gets to be an American? Who has equality before the law? Who should have the right to vote? Those questions, which were fundamental to Reconstruction, are so fundamental to our people today. And as soon as Donald Trump lost the election, and as soon as Georgia turned Democratic, thanks to Stacey Abrams, what happened throughout the South? What happened? All these new so-called voter neutral regulations on voting, which, as you know, are targeted against us, are trying to keep us away from the polls.
Yes, sir.
And we cannot let that happen. That would be a nightmare. That would be the rollback of Reconstruction all over again.
Yes. Yes. And I imagine you're exactly right that when history, if we allow it to repeat itself, but that formula that you mentioned about protecting that right to vote, we were very much so activated as Black folks then, and clearly we're still activated now. And hopefully that is going to continue in places like Texas and in places like Georgia and Florida throughout the American South to make sure that we as Black folks and all Americans have the opportunity to get out and exercise that right to vote, sir. I greatly appreciate you mentioning legislatures and the politics of these things. And I want to stay in this family of ideas here and shift a bit, though, to talk about a friend of yours who developed a very widely respected idea, and that is critical race theory. And that is the late law professor Derek Bell.
Right.
If he were alive today, sir, Faces at the Bottom of the Well was a groundbreaking moment, not only in African-American studies, but in American Academy in general. Now, all of a sudden, we had a new way of addressing and thinking about race relations in the United States. If Derek Bell was alive today, sir, what would he say about the debate over critical race theory in the United States of America overall, and particularly the idea it wouldn't be taught in K through 12 in general?
Well, you know, Jason, critical race theory is a very specific set of principles and tenets. And argument, I guess the godfather was my former beloved colleague, Derek Bell, right here in the Harvard Law School. Jelani Cobb has a long essay about Derek and critical race theory in the latest New Yorker, just went online this week, and I commend that to everyone. And of course, then the concept of intersectionality, which was formulated so brilliantly by my friend Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a major presence in our documentary. Mm-hmm. But somehow teaching Black history has come to be called critical race theory and demonizes critical race theory by people who don't want Black history taught. Yeah. So everybody in this audience should know they're two different things. And I certainly support teaching critical race theory, but it's not the tenets of critical race theory that we're trying to get taught in elementary schools, middle schools, and high school. We're just trying to get them to teach African American history, the contributions of people of African descent, starting with the Nubian, the Black pharaohs of the Nile, the 25th dynasty, you know, and Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, the richest man in the world. If you go to networth.com right now and type in who is the richest man in the history of the world, it wasn't Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. It was Mansa Musa, who was the emperor of Mali, who made a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1325. There are so many aspects of our history. And we don't even have to start in Africa, though that's a good place to start. Yes. Just the Black presence in the United States has been fundamental from the beginning to the shaping of our economy, our prosperity, our notions of democracy, who we are as a people. What does it mean to be an American? You cannot answer that question without understanding the Black experience. You cannot answer that question without understanding the experience of the people who were here in the first place when Europeans showed up and performed genocide and appropriated their land. Right. The Native Americans, the First Nation, as they are called in Canada. And you cannot understand the history of America without understanding the history of immigration. Yes. This is what made it. We're a nation of immigrants. Even the Native Americans migrated here 15,000 years ago across the Bering Strait. And our ancestors, of course, were unwilling immigrants. As Malcolm X said, we didn't come on the Mayflower. He said, we didn't land at Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. But these are fundamental. Why is it so threatening? Well, I'll tell you why. And it's what Martin Luther King pointed out. He was referring to Dr. Du Bois's book, published in 1935, which Eric Foner and I are republishing in a new edition from the Library of America. And that book was called Black Reconstruction. And Du Bois was reinterpreting, taking back the narrative, which had been created by a racist school of historians called the Dunning School, based at Columbia University, and of course, very popular throughout the South, that said the worst moment in the history of America was when Black men dominated state legislatures throughout the South. And you know the film Birth of a Nation, which, Jason, I made my students watch over 2 periods because they didn't want to watch it. Oh, yeah. We tend to think Birth of a Nation, ladies and gentlemen, is the most racist film in the history of filmmaking. Yes, that is my scholarly opinion. Yes. And we tend to think that it's about the Civil War. It's not. It's about Reconstruction. He said all those black men wanted to do was pass laws saying that they could marry white women. Now that sounds like an exaggeration, but it is true. That is what those scenes are depicted. And then the trope of Gus the rapist. You know, a through line in the film is this black man, is that this black man wants to rape this specific white woman who leaps to her death rather than, you know, suffer rape. It's horrible. It created this image of black men being lascivious, you know, wanton, having uncontrollable physical desires, and lacking reason. You know, after Descartes, what's a human being? You think, therefore you are, right? Right. But they argued, starting in the Enlightenment, that black people weren't reasonable. We didn't think like Europeans. We acted, we emoted, we were a different species of men, as David Hume put it. And Immanuel Kant echoed that in 11 years later, in 1764, when he said that some man had said something, but what he said was clearly stupid, Kant said, because he was black from head to toe. There you see the moment when a physical characteristic is conflated with an aspect of your character. You're stupid. Why? Because you're black. And we still are punished by that kind of stereotype. When we walk into a room, we have to overcome these centuries of stereotypes about our people. That no, we are not controlled by our passions. Yes, we are as intelligent as anybody else. I remember they used to say a black man could never be a quarterback.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Smart enough to memorize all these plays. You know,
that's right.
Hello, ask Dak.
Or Doug Williams.
Yes, but you know, these kind that we can laugh about it, but it is so sad. Because we are still called upon as black people, even in the academy today, to disprove these racist stereotypes, which have such a long and tortured history in the Western imagination. And that's what the rise of Reconstruction and its rollback were all about, because the idea of black power is manifested through the polling booth was too much for Americans to bear. And so the North, which had fought to end slavery, joined hands with the South within 30 years of the end of the Civil War to roll back Reconstruction completely. It officially ends in 1877, but it takes until the 1890s for those state constitutional conventions to be voted on, passed, and then implemented for the full force of the rollback to Reconstruction to be implemented. And that's what happened. That's why John Lewis gets his head broken open on Pettus Bridge in March of 1965. What was that march about? Voting rights. Why did they have to do it? Because of the state constitutional convention, starting with the Mississippi Plan in 1890. That is the real history. And that is the reason that these state Republican legislatures don't want to teach black history and are demonizing the teaching of this real history, because you know we're going to get into Reconstruction and its rollback. And even a child will realize that that's what's going on in legislatures today.
Yes, I greatly appreciate that answer, sir. There's such, and I liked how you mentioned earlier that even we as African Americans are very much so unaware of the power of the Reconstruction era.
Oh, let me give you, sorry to interrupt, let me give you 2 examples from Finding Your Roots. And I'd like to thank everybody for making Finding Your Roots the #1 show on PBS. I'm very happy about that. Chris Rock. I did Chris Rock's Family Tree. You can go to YouTube and watch it. I tell him that one of his direct ancestors, a great-great-grandfather, was elected to the South Carolina legislature in the year 1872, and Chris Rock had no idea. Not only did he have no idea, Jason, he started to cry. And I almost cried. I mean, first I thought he was going to make a joke out of him, you know, because he's so brilliantly funny. But he said this would have changed his whole life. And I said, well, what do you mean? He went to his mother when he was about 12 and said, I want to be a politician when I grow up. And she said, black boys can't grow up to be politicians. Yeah. You need to learn to do something else. Yeah. And this was in his family tree, and as it were, in his DNA. Yes. And Congressman John Lewis, the man who risked his life on Pettus Bridge for the Voting Rights Act. Yes. Jason, I said to him, you know, I say, this is your book of life. I said, please turn the page. He turned the page. He said, what am I looking at? I said, John, you are looking at your great-great-grandfather's voter registration certificate from 1867. Wow. He was one of those black men. 80% of all eligible black men throughout the former South registered to vote in that wonderful, exhilarating Freedom Summer of 1867. And John Lewis's great-great-grandfather was one of them. Isn't that incredible? Wow, that's amazing. I mean, and it's the richness of the family history. I have to tell you that 2 years ago, you inspired my wife and I to buy 10 family genetic tests and spread them out to family across the country so we could trace it all back. You have inspired so many families to do that so we can learn our family history in ways that we did not before. And that's clearly because that knowledge is empowering. Knowing where you come from and where your ancestors have already accomplished lets you know what has been done already and what you can do and where you can go beyond them. And that's why that was so powerful a moment for Chris Rock there, sir. I want to keep going with this, but sort of turn it in another direction, though. And in your documentaries, there's one of the key themes that cuts across a lot of them is the idea of the black middle class. And some of the changing dynamics of class polarization and inequality within Black America. I've shown the documentary, The Two Nations of Black America, as part of my contemporary Black experience class for years. Oh, thank you. My students have always loved it, me included. It inspires so much research that I've done. But here's my question related to the differences. You know, there's some of us in Black America doing better and better than ever before. There are some of us who are still trapped behind in poverty, just like we were at the end of the civil rights movement. My question, though, sir, is what does that mean for today's world with respect to that debate over race versus class in today's world? What does it mean when we have more Black folks doing better and better, but then it raises questions about the prevalence of discrimination in the modern America today? No, that's an excellent point. Well, as you know, since that terrible day in 1968 when Dr. King was so brutally assassinated, the Black middle class has doubled. The Black upper middle class has quadrupled. Yes. It's the best of times. It's the worst of times. For people like you and me, your brother-in-law, Adam Bradley, and in the English department at UCLA, and so many people watching us this evening, affirmative action opened up what I think of as the escalator of class mobility in America. We would have been in the old Black middle class behind the color line, and now we were able to seize these opportunities and become members of the broader American middle and upper middle class. I'll give you my own example. September 1969, I show up at Yale. I'm definitely a product of affirmative action. Why would I say that? Because the class of 66 at Yale had 6 Black men to graduate. The class that entered Yale with me in 1969 had 96 Black men and women. And who was in my class? Oh, so first of all, 6 to 96. What was their genetic blip in the race? And all of a sudden, 90 smart Black people didn't exist a few years before. And who was in my class? Sheila Jackson Lee. Oh, wow. She is. Yeah. I mean, Sheila Jackson then. Yeah. And she met Elwyn Lee, I think, the first weekend at the first party. Oh, that's wild. And they've been together ever since. Kurt Schmoke, the first Black mayor of Baltimore. Yes. There was a nerdy little pre-med guy. Let me see. What was his name? You know, he didn't hang that much because he was studying. Let me see. Oh, yeah. Ben Carson. Oh, no. Wow. Really? Let me say, Ben and I don't agree on politics. Yeah. On everything about politics. But he's a good brother. And I don't believe in demonizing people for their beliefs. And I think that's very important for us to remember as Americans. And then little old me bringing up the rear. We were able to join the broader American middle and upper middle class because of affirmative action, because Yale dismantled a racist quota that they had for years.
Yes.
There were always only 4 or 5 black people there. You know, they even had a quota on Roman Catholics until about 1963, not to mention Jewish people.
Right.
So all affirmative action did was let us compete in real numbers with white students and other students of, you know, in the application pool. Yeah. So what we have to do, though, is the fact that the black middle class has doubled and the black upper middle class has quadrupled is not enough. We need the curve of class, as I put it, for the black community to look like the curve of class for the white community.
Yes.
What's that mean? The same percentage of people in each of the classes.
Yes. That
would be a real economic revolution in the history of this country. And that's what we have to work toward. Yes. Until the pandemic, if you looked at the percentage of black children who lived in poverty, say in 1970, and the percentage of black children who lived in poverty at that time in America before the pandemic, they were not that far apart. The percentage of black children born out of wedlock is extraordinarily high. We have to fight these problems. And I think the most radical thing we could do, Jason, is what I like to say, we should bust the dollars from the rich white school districts to the poor Black and Latino school districts. Why should children in Palo Alto or Princeton, New Jersey, or Cambridge, Massachusetts, why should the amount of money spent per child be higher in middle class and upper middle class neighborhoods than it is in lower middle class and lower economic neighborhoods? The amount of money spent per child should be exactly the same across each state, and in my opinion, throughout the United States. But some people say that's too radical. It's going to be hard enough to get. Can you imagine the Texas legislature voting on that in Texas? I don't think so, but it should. That would produce a radical transformation in our educational system, because education is the way out of poverty. It is the only way out of poverty. It's what brought us all to the table.
Skip, this is such an amazing conversation. I study religion. That's really where I have made my strongest contributions to the literature. Let me also say I have published 2 articles in the Du Bois Review, which is centered at Harvard as well. Those are 2 major contributions that I've made over the course of my career. But one of the things that I really want to ask you about goes back to the recent documentary on the Black church. It's an amazing film. I can't wait to show it to my sociology or religion class next semester. I want to explore one topic a little bit in detail that you addressed in the film, and that is young people who are moving away from the Black church. We've got growing numbers of Black folks, for all the reasons you mentioned in the film, leaving the church. But what is Black culture? What is Black identity? What are Black politics if divorced and separated from the church? What does it mean for young people who are leaving the church? How do we understand Blackness if it is divorced from organized religion?
The church is the root of African American culture. Our politics, our economics, our music, our poetry, all comes out of the Black church. There's no doubt about it. Where would we be without the Black church? And unlike other Christian denominations, our religion was always, though it was about trying to get you into heaven and trying to keep you on the straight and narrow, but it really was also about finding heaven on earth. And what would heaven on earth be? A post-racist America. The Black church was born as the Black church was born in political resistance, starting with Richard Allen and Absalom Jones at St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia. When Absalom Jones in 1792, 1793, he sits down in the white pew, and an usher comes and tells him to get up. So all the Black people, tired of sitting in the back, sitting in the balcony, they get up and they leave and they form Bethel Church Absalom Jones forms a Black Episcopal denomination. Richard Allen, the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, which is formally incorporated in 1816. And boom, the history of Black Christianity is launched, in the history of the 7 major denominations that broadly construed we call the Black Church, culminating in 1895 with the National Baptist Convention, and between 1895 and 1897 with the Church of God in Christ. Jason, you know this history even better than I do. But the church was also a laboratory. You know, people would come there, they'd learn how to speak. I did my first piece when I was about 3 or 4. Mine was Jesus was a boy like me, and like him I want to be. And I actually forgot all the words. And I stood there Easter Sunday in front of all of the Black people in Piedmont, West Virginia. Seemed like I was speaking before an audience at Yankee Stadium, and I completely lost my voice. my darling mother stood up and recited my whole piece. That was the auspicious debut of the public lecturing performance of Henry Louis Gates Jr. But you all know experiences like that. You had to do a piece on, say your piece at Christmas, say your piece at Easter. I sang in the choir, and so many of our great musicians started with a base in the church. The most famous probably is Aretha Franklin in Reverend C.L. Franklin's church, but Mahalia Jackson. There's so many. I mean, I'd be here all night. You all know this as well as I do. But the church is at a crossroads, and the church was very slow to respond to HIV, AIDS, very slow to condemn homophobia, very slow to condemn its own sexism. The AME Church starts in 1816. Vashti McKenzie becomes the first female bishop in the year 2000. That's ridiculous. Overwhelming percent of Christian congregants in the Black church are African-American women. So that the church has a lot of self-critique and self-criticism to do, but the leaders of the church are not stupid. They know, as Bishop Jones, Grace Jones's brother, told me once, their job was to keep more people coming in the front doors of the church than backsliding out the back door. And the only way you can do that is to meet people where they are. You know, we have to forget all this stuff about the curses on a person because of their sexuality or their sexual orientation, their politics, their ideology, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a younger generation of church leaders are doing just that. They have no choice, Jason. If they don't, the church is going to shut down. And of course, there would be no Black people without the Black church. So that's not going to happen. But the church, as we knew it when we were kids, is going to be a thing of the past, which is, it will be new, vibrant, dynamic, but it will be in a new form. It will be built on, constructed on the church that raised us, the church in which we were raised, but it will be different. The music is different. The forms of worship are different. I don't like the new music, but I'm old school, you know. I like R&B and soul. I like Soul Town on Sirius XM radio. You know, that's where my head is. So I like gospel music. I like the spirituals like Dr. Du Bois did. But we have to be flexible, and the leadership that's emerging will be flexible because that new leadership is young. It is part and parcel of the young generation trying to redefine the role of the church.
Well, Skip, I thought that was fascinating. I really, I agree with so much of what you're saying, except for the music part. I like the contemporary music, sir. I really do, boy. And I grew up in the AME church, and I'm Methodist now, still in that Black family in terms of United Methodist, the actual church we go to here, but it's very contemporary. Mm-hmm. And so, as you know, the church it's got to change. It's got to evolve. Age, politics, all these things are really important matters. And I greatly appreciate you mentioning that. And in the documentary, it was just tremendous. I cannot wait to show that to my sociology of religion class next semester. It's going to be fantastic.
Great. And guess what? The sequel is going to be the history of gospel music.
Wow, that will be, oh, yeah, that's amazing. And that is a genre that is also changing. And a lot of young Black folks don't know that the same way. And I think a lot of that is also connected, sir, to some of that growth of the Black middle class. There are a lot of us that don't feel like there's that trial and tribulation and struggle. They sort of grew up in the middle class, came of age, and so maybe they don't see the church in the ways that our parents and grandparents' generation saw it, as that making a way out of no way, sort of way of life.
I know, and that is the epigraph of the African American experiences, making a way out of no way, because there were people out there who tried to crush us.
Yes.
And we did not let it happen. And without the church, even, I'll give you an example. When I was writing this, for all you graduate students out there, when I was writing my PhD thesis, oh my God, I was so worried that I couldn't finish it, or they were going to turn it down. So every Sunday I would go to the Black church at Yale, interdenominational, of course.
Yes.
And the minister was Reverend Dwight Andrews, who's a congregational minister in Atlanta now, and a professor of music at Emory. One of my best friends. He married me, and he baptized both of my daughters. And at the end, we'd form a big circle and join hands and say, "We come this far by faith." And I'd say, "Lord, I've come this far by faith. Let me get my PhD, please." Right back to tears.
That's right. Oh yeah, we all can relate to those stories, boy.
Yeah.
If graduate still don't make you find a little bit of church, I don't know what will.
And we have to keep our guard up. You know, we have, as you said, we have made tremendous strides since Dr. King was killed. Yes. But there are people who would put us back in forms of neo-slavery. Look at the incarceration rate. The prison industrial complex is the 21st century version of sharecropping, peonage, the chain gang mentality, and the rollback. That's another way to disenfranchise Black men and Black women, is to put them in jail and then say, nope, even if you do your time, you never will have the right to vote. So we have to be vigilant. We have to be on guard. We have to be united, and we have to seek allies across the color line.
Yes.
We can't do it on our own. No. We're all in this together to create a greater America, an America that lives up to its brilliant founding principles, greatest experiment in the history of humankind in terms of democracy. And we have to hold our country's feet to the fire and make it live up to its principles. And together, we can do it. And it starts with the school system. It starts with teaching 5-year-old. My beautiful granddaughter is 6. She's a proud first grader. She has to have a curriculum that integrates seamlessly the accomplishments of people of color along with the accomplishments of people of Anglo-Saxon descent. Because what are the schools about? It's in school that you learn how to be a citizen. Remember, my country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Oh, say, can you see? America the beautiful. All that stuff was like osmosis, man. It was like the air we breathed. By the time you were 7, you were an American citizen. It was like invisible civics class.
Yes.
Well, I want Harriet Tubman to be instilled invisibly. I want Frederick Douglass to be instilled invisibly. I want Mary McLeod Bethune to be instilled. I want the great Du Bois to be instilled invisibly. I want every child who graduates from primary school, middle school, and high school to know about the accomplishments and achievements of our people. And if they don't, then they are not truly an educated person.
Skip, this has been absolutely amazing. Thank you, sir. I got one last question to get you out of here, because I know you're a busy man, and we are so appreciative of your time this evening, sir. In light of it being your birthday, you have had such an amazing, successful career, an amazing life, traveled the world. If you mentioned the trials and tribulation of grad school, of course, there are students that are watching here tonight. If you could go back and tell yourself, knowing what you know now, what is the advice that you would have given yourself now, knowing what you know? What are the pieces of the little tidbits of knowledge to move forward to inspire yourself years ago and these young people now? What would it be, sir?
Take your time. You're going to be all right. Give yourself time to breathe and enjoy. Explore the widest range of courses as an undergraduate. Because you will never, ever be in a position to read freely. Basically, you're being paid and you're paying, of course, but you're being paid and are paying to read and write, to contemplate great ideas with brilliant professors. Use that time to become a broadly, liberally educated human being, because it will escape all too quickly and it will never come back again.
Skip, thank you so much. If there is, I'm going to leave the last words to you, sir. If there's something that you'd like to part us with, any last words, remarks, anything of the sort, sir?
Well, I'd say, regardless of our ideological differences, we must link arms and stand or kneel publicly together against anti-Semitism, against homophobia, against Islamophobia, against anti-Black racism, and, ladies and gentlemen, against white supremacist ideology in all of its pernicious, ugly, violent forms. This is no time for equivocation or false equivalences. This is a time for truth.
Thank you very much, sir. I greatly appreciate it. Thank everyone for tuning in this evening for our first Maverick Speakers series. We've got more along the way. Also, again, this is the 10th anniversary for the Center for African American Studies. Next week, we will be hosting Roland Martin on campus on the 29th. Please come out to that. We've got some other people that are coming all year long. And please continue to support the Maverick Speaker Series as well. Thanks for coming out, y'all. God bless. Good night.
Good night. Thank you. Thank you so much.